No one wanted the paralyzed bride at the station, but the quiet cowboy carried her to his cabin. The sun burned mercilessly over Redemption Creek Station that October morning in 1873, casting long shadows across the wooden platform where a lone figure sat motionless in a weathered wheelchair. The train had departed 20 minutes ago, leaving behind a cloud of black smoke and the bitter taste of broken promises. Margaret Thorne adjusted the worn blanket covering her legs, her green eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the man who was supposed to meet her. The marriage broker in Chicago had assured her that Thomas Whitmore was eager for a wife, that he understood her condition completely. The letters they had exchanged over 6 months painted him as a kind, understanding rancher who needed companionship more than anything else. But Thomas Whitmore was nowhere to be found. The other passengers from her train car had long since been collected by their waiting families or disappeared into the dusty streets of the frontier town. Even the station master kept glancing at her with growing concern, clearly wondering what to do with the abandoned woman who could not simply walk away from her predicament. Margaret had traveled over 1,000 miles from Illinois, carrying nothing but a small leather suitcase and the fragile hope that somewhere in the untamed West she might find acceptance. The accident that had stolen the use of her legs 3 years earlier had also stolen her future in Chicago, where suitors vanished the moment they learned of her paralysis. Heat waves shimmered off the dusty ground as another hour passed. The station master approached her twice, offering water and expressing his growing worry. But Margaret remained composed. She had survived far worse than being stranded. What frightened her most was not the abandonment itself, but the familiar sting of rejection that cut deeper than any physical pain. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a tall figure emerging from behind the grain warehouse. He moved with the unhurried gait of someone accustomed to solitude, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Unlike the other men in town who wore their finest clothes for conducting business, this stranger dressed in simple work clothes dusty from recent labor. James Coleman had been loading supplies when he first spotted the woman by the tracks. Something about her stillness drew his attention away from the mundane task of securing fence posts to his wagon. He had watched from a distance as the crowd around the station thinned, leaving her increasingly isolated. At 34, James had grown comfortable with his reputation as Redemption Creek's most reliable hermit. His ranch sat 15 miles outside town, far enough to discourage casual visitors, but close enough to make the necessary trips for supplies. Most folks respected his preference for solitude, especially after the tragedy that had driven him from his previous life in Colorado. But watching someone being abandoned stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. Up close, he could see the tension in her shoulders, despite her carefully maintained composure. Her dress, though travel-worn, had been carefully mended and pressed. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a practical style that suggested both dignity and determination. "Excuse me, miss," James said quietly, removing his hat. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here quite some time. Is there someone I could help you locate?" Margaret looked up, meeting eyes that were surprisingly gentle for someone with such a weathered face. She had expected pity or curiosity, but found neither. Instead, she saw genuine concern mixed with careful respect. "I was expecting to meet Thomas Whitmore," she replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I am Margaret Thorne, his intended bride from Chicago, though it appears he has reconsidered our arrangement." James knew Thomas Whitmore by reputation. The man owned a moderately successful cattle operation, but was known more for his drinking and gambling than his reliability. The idea that Whitmore had arranged for a mail-order bride and then failed to collect her filled James with quiet anger. "Thomas left town yesterday morning with a poker debt and a bottle of whiskey," James said carefully. "I suspect he won't be returning anytime soon." The information landed like a physical blow, but Margaret absorbed it without flinching. She had survived her accident, months of painful recovery, and the slow dissolution of everything she had once believed about her future. This betrayal was simply another obstacle to overcome. "I see," she said simply. "Then I suppose I should inquire about return passage to Chicago." "The next eastbound train won't arrive for 4 days," James replied. "And I suspect the hotel won't be suitable for a lady in your situation." Margaret understood his meaning immediately. Redemption Creek was a rough frontier town where single women without male protection faced dangers that went far beyond simple inconvenience. Her disability would make her even more vulnerable to the kind of men who preyed on the desperate. James found himself studying her face as she processed this information. There was no panic in her expression, no theatrical despair. Instead, she seemed to be calculating her options with the methodical approach of someone accustomed to solving difficult problems. "I have some savings," Margaret said finally. "Perhaps I could arrange temporary lodging somewhere safe until the train arrives." Something in her quiet dignity reminded James of his sister Catherine, who had faced her own impossible circumstances with similar courage. Before he could reconsider the impulse, he heard himself making an offer that surprised them both. "My ranch has a spare room," he said quietly. "It's clean and private, and you'd be safe there until you can make proper arrangements." Margaret studied his face carefully. She had learned to read people quickly since her accident, to distinguish between those who offered help out of genuine kindness and those who saw her vulnerability as an opportunity. This stranger's offer felt different from the others she had encountered. "I don't even know your name," she said. "James Coleman. I run a horse ranch about 15 miles west of here. I keep to myself mostly, but I have a housekeeper who comes twice a week." Mrs. Patterson would see that everything stays proper. The practicality of his offer was undeniable. Margaret's savings would not stretch to cover hotel expenses for 4 days, especially not in a frontier town where prices reflected scarcity rather than fairness. More importantly, something in James's manner suggested she could trust him. "That is very generous, Mr. Coleman. I accept your offer with gratitude." James nodded once, then walked to his wagon without another word. Margaret watched him efficiently rearrange the supplies to make room for a passenger, his movements economical and purposeful. When he returned, he lifted her from the wheelchair with surprising gentleness, as if he had experience handling fragile things. The wheelchair folded easily and fit alongside the fence posts. James helped Margaret settle onto the wagon seat, ensuring she was secure before taking up the reins. As they rolled away from the station, Margaret found herself leaving behind more than just a broken promise. For the first time in years, she was traveling towards something unknown, without a detailed plan. The ride to James's ranch took them through landscape that shifted gradually from the dusty browns of the settled area to the deeper greens of untouched prairie. Rolling hills stretched toward distant mountains, broken by creek beds lined with cottonwood trees beginning to show their autumn colors. James proved to be a comfortable traveling companion. He answered her questions about the terrain and wildlife without overwhelming her with unnecessary conversation. When Margaret mentioned her interest in the various birds they encountered, he identified each species with the casual expertise of someone who paid attention to his surroundings. "You know quite a bit about the local fauna," Margaret observed as they paused to water the horses at a creek crossing. "Spending time alone teaches you to notice things," James replied simply. His ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, nestled in a valley protected from the worst prairie winds. The house was larger than Margaret had expected, built from local stone and timber, with careful attention to both durability and comfort. Corrals and outbuildings were arranged with similar thoughtfulness, suggesting an owner who planned for the long term. James helped Margaret from the wagon, then retrieved her wheelchair from among the supplies. The house had a wide front porch with a gentle ramp that allowed easy access. Margaret noticed immediately that navigating the entrance would present no difficulties. "Did you build this yourself?" she asked as they approached the front door. "Most of it. I had help with the stonework." The interior was surprisingly well appointed for a bachelor's home. The furniture was sturdy and functional, but someone had taken care to add touches that made the space welcoming rather than merely utilitarian. Curtains framed the windows and books lined shelves built into the stone walls. "The spare room is back here," James said, leading her down a hallway. "It has its own entrance if you prefer privacy." The room was spacious and clean, with large windows offering views of the surrounding hills. A comfortable bed stood against one wall, and a writing desk occupied the space near the windows. Most importantly, the doorways and layout allowed Margaret to move about freely. "This is perfect," she said, meaning it completely. James left her to settle in while he tended to the horses. Margaret used the time to explore the house more thoroughly, impressed by the thoughtful design that seemed to anticipate the needs of someone with mobility challenges. The kitchen counters were slightly lower than standard, and doorways had been built wider than necessary. When James returned, Margaret was sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the hills in shades of gold and purple. "This is beautiful country," she said as he joined her. "It grows on you," James replied, settling into a chair beside her wheelchair. "May I ask why you built your house this way? The ramps, the wider doors?" James was quiet for so long that Margaret wondered if she had overstepped some boundary. Finally, he spoke in a voice carefully stripped of emotion. "My sister Catherine lived with me for 2 years before she died. She used a wheelchair after a riding accident damaged her spine. I learned to build things she could navigate easily." The revelation explained much about his immediate understanding of Margaret's situation. She recognized the grief in his voice, the careful control that suggested wounds not yet fully healed. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said simply. "She would have liked you," James replied. Catherine had the same way of facing difficult situations without complaint. Over the following days, Margaret discovered that life at the Coleman Ranch followed comfortable routines that made room for her presence without dramatic adjustments. James rose before dawn to tend the horses, returning for breakfast that they shared in companionable near silence. He spent his days working with the animals or maintaining equipment, while Margaret occupied herself with mending, reading, or simply enjoying the vast quiet of the prairie. Mrs. Patterson arrived on the second day, a woman in her 50s with the no-nonsense manner of someone accustomed to managing practical difficulties. She accepted Margaret's presence without question, treating her as a temporary member of the household rather than an object of curiosity. "James told me you're waiting for the eastbound train," Mrs. Patterson said as they prepared lunch together. "Shame about Thomas Whitmore. That man couldn't keep a promise if his life depended on it." Margaret had grown comfortable discussing her situation without embarrassment. "Perhaps it's for the best. A marriage based on deception rarely succeeds. You planning to return to Chicago?" The question had been weighing on Margaret's mind since her arrival at the ranch. Chicago offered familiar surroundings and a few distant relatives, but little in the way of genuine opportunity. Her savings would not last long in the city, and prospects for employment remained limited. "I'm not entirely certain," Margaret admitted. "My circumstances have changed considerably." Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the window, where James could be seen working with a young horse in the corral. "James is a good man," she said carefully. "Lost his way for a while after Catherine died, but he's finding it again." That evening, Margaret broached the subject that had been occupying her thoughts. "James, I've been wondering about something. When you offered to help me at the station, you didn't hesitate despite not knowing anything about me. Why?" James considered the question while staring out at the darkening hills. "In Colorado, before I came here, I had a ranch with my business partner. When Catherine's accident happened, I needed to care for her. My partner decided that wasn't good for business and forced me out." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I learned that most people will abandon you when life becomes inconvenient, but I also learned that the ones who don't abandon you are worth everything." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she had not experienced since before her accident. "Is that why you moved here?" "Partly. I wanted to build something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's decision. This ranch, this life, it belongs to me completely. And you're content with the solitude?" James looked at her directly for the first time since they had begun talking. "I was. Until recently." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Margaret felt her carefully maintained composure falter slightly, not from distress but from an unexpected flutter of hope. "The train comes tomorrow," she said quietly. "Yes. I could wire for additional funds and wait for the next one." James turned to face her fully. "Or you could stay." The simple statement carried the weight of everything they had not yet spoken aloud. Margaret had spent 3 days observing James Coleman, noting his kindness, his competence, and the way he treated her disability as simply another aspect of who she was rather than a defining limitation. What would that mean exactly? It would mean whatever we decide it means. No predetermined expectations, no promises made by strangers through letters. Just 2 people who seemed to get along well, figuring out if they might get along even better. Margaret had traveled west seeking a predetermined future, a marriage arrangement that would provide security in exchange for companionship. What James was offering was far more uncertain, but also far more genuine. "I have very little to offer," she said honestly. "My condition limits certain possibilities." "Margaret," James said, his voice gentle but firm, "you've been here 3 days. In that time, you've mended more clothes than I've managed in 6 months, organized my books in a way that actually makes sense, and improved Mrs. Patterson's bread recipe. More than that, this house feels different with someone else in it. Better. Different how? Less like a place I'm hiding and more like a place I'm living." Margaret studied his face in the fading light, seeing sincerity mixed with vulnerability. James Coleman was offering her something she had never expected to find: acceptance without conditions, partnership without predetermined roles. "If I stayed," she said carefully, "what would people in town think? They'd think what they always think about me, which is very little. And eventually, if things went well between us, they'd think I'd gotten lucky." Margaret laughed, a sound that surprised them both with its genuine warmth. "You realize I know nothing about ranching. You realize I know nothing about having a partner. We'd both be learning as we go. Seems like the best way to build something real." Margaret looked out at the hills that had become familiar over the past few days, then at the man who had rescued her from abandonment without expecting anything in return. The future he was offering contained no guarantees, but it also contained no deceptions. "The next eastbound train comes in 4 more days," she said finally. James smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Then we have 4 days to see if this feels like something worth building." Margaret reached out and took his hand, feeling calluses earned through honest work and strength that spoke of reliability rather than force. "I think it already does." As autumn deepened into winter, Margaret discovered that life at the Coleman Ranch suited her in ways she had never anticipated. James proved to be an ideal partner, sharing decisions about everything from daily routines to long-term improvements to the property. He consulted her about purchases, listened to her suggestions about efficiency, and gradually included her in every aspect of managing their shared life. Margaret's skills with organization and planning complemented James's practical knowledge perfectly. Together they developed systems for everything from horse breeding records to household management that made both their lives easier. When spring arrived, Margaret was keeping the ranch's financial records and corresponding with buyers for James's horses. Mrs. Patterson had long since stopped referring to Margaret as a visitor. The older woman treated her as the lady of the house, seeking her input on everything from menu planning to which rooms needed repainting. Margaret had found the sense of belonging she had given up hoping for years earlier. The people of Redemption Creek had eventually grown accustomed to seeing Margaret Coleman accompanying her husband to town. James had married her in a simple ceremony at the local church 6 months after her arrival, with Mrs. Patterson and the minister's wife as witnesses. Margaret wore a dress of deep blue wool that complemented her eyes, and James wore his best suit with a wildflower boutonniere that matched her bouquet. Their marriage was based on partnership and growing affection rather than desperate necessity or romantic fantasy. James built Margaret a workshop where she could pursue her interest in bookbinding, a skill she had learned during her recovery in Chicago. Margaret encouraged James to expand his horse breeding operation, helping him research bloodlines and maintain correspondence with potential buyers. By their first anniversary, the Coleman Ranch had acquired a reputation for producing some of the finest horses in the territory. Margaret had established a small but profitable business restoring and rebinding books for the growing number of educated settlers in the region. Their combined efforts had transformed the ranch from a simple retreat into a thriving operation. Most importantly, they had discovered that their initial assessment of compatibility had been remarkably accurate. James's steady temperament balanced Margaret's occasional impulsiveness, while her organizational skills complemented his intuitive understanding of livestock and land management. They worked together efficiently and lived together contentfully. Margaret often thought about the train that had brought her west and the man who had failed to meet her at the station. Thomas Whitmore's abandonment, which had seemed like devastating rejection at the time, had actually delivered her to exactly where she belonged. On quiet evenings, when they sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the hills they had both come to love, Margaret would sometimes reach for James's hand and reflect on the unexpected turns that had brought them together. She had traveled west, seeking security through a predetermined arrangement, but had instead found something far more valuable, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the kind of deep compatibility that could not be arranged through letters. James had given up his solitary life, not out of loneliness, but because he had found someone whose presence enhanced rather than disrupted the peace he had worked so hard to create. Together they had built something that belonged entirely to them, a life that could not be altered by other people's decisions or limited by society's expectations. The quiet cowboy who had carried the abandoned bride away from the station had given her more than rescue. He had given her a future worth building, one day at a time, in the vast freedom of the Western Territory they had both chosen to call home. Their second winter brought unexpected challenges that tested the strength of their partnership in ways neither had anticipated. A harsh blizzard in January damaged part of the main barn, and 3 of their best mares were injured when panicked horses broke through weakened fence posts during the storm. James worked 18-hour days repairing damage and caring for the injured animals, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Margaret took over every aspect of household management, stretching their food supplies and maintaining correspondence with concerned buyers who had heard rumors about storm damage throughout the territory. "We might lose the Appleton contract," James said one evening, slumping into his chair with defeat evident in every line of his body. "They're saying they can't wait for spring delivery if our breeding stock is compromised." Margaret had been preparing for this conversation. She rolled her wheelchair to the desk and retrieved a folder of papers she had been organizing throughout the crisis. "I've been corresponding with horse breeders in Colorado and Wyoming," she said calmly. "There are 3 operations willing to provide replacement breeding stock in exchange for future foals from our established bloodlines." James looked up, surprised by both her initiative and her thoroughness. "I also wrote to the Appletons directly," Margaret continued. "I explained our situation honestly and provided references from our other clients. They've agreed to extend their contract through summer delivery." "Margaret," James said slowly, "how did you manage all of that while I was focused on the immediate damage?" "Partnership means thinking beyond the crisis at hand," she replied simply. "While you handled the emergency, I protected our future." That night, as they sat by the fire discussing plans for rebuilding, James realized that his wife had not merely adapted to ranch life. She had become essential to its success in ways that went far beyond what either of them had originally envisioned. Spring brought renewal in more ways than one. Margaret discovered she was pregnant in April, news that filled them both with joy tinged by concern about the practical challenges her condition might present during pregnancy and childbirth. Dr. Dow Harrison, the physician who traveled the territory serving remote ranches, examined Margaret carefully and pronounced her pregnancy normal despite her paralysis. He recommended modifications to their daily routines and promised to be available when the time came for delivery. "Your spine injury doesn't affect the muscles needed for childbirth," he explained to both of them during his visit. "Women with similar conditions have delivered healthy babies successfully. The main concern will be ensuring you have adequate support during the final months." James immediately began researching everything he could find about pregnancy and paralysis, writing to medical colleges and consulting with other doctors through lengthy correspondence. Margaret appreciated his concern, but refused to be treated as fragile. "I survived a train accident, abandonment, and 2 harsh winters," she reminded him when he suggested she reduce her involvement in ranch work. "I think I can handle growing our child." As her pregnancy progressed, Margaret and James worked together to prepare their home for a baby. James built a specially designed cradle that could be easily accessed from a wheelchair, and Margaret sewed clothes and blankets during the long summer evenings. Mrs. Patterson proved invaluable during this time, sharing practical wisdom about childbirth and infant care while helping with increasingly demanding household tasks. The older woman had delivered several babies during her younger years and served as an additional source of reassurance for both expectant parents. "You're both overthinking this," she told them one afternoon, while helping Margaret preserve vegetables from their garden. "Babies need love, food, and clean diapers. Everything else works itself out." Margaret went into labor during a thunderstorm in late October, exactly 2 years after her arrival at Redemption Creek Station. James had prepared meticulously for this moment, but found himself nearly paralyzed by anxiety as Margaret's contractions intensified. Dr. Harrison arrived just as the storm reached its peak, his horse and medical bag soaked from the torrential rain. He took control of the situation with calm professionalism, directing James and Mrs. Patterson while reassuring Margaret throughout the lengthy labor. Catherine Elizabeth Coleman was born just before dawn, a healthy baby with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined spirit. Margaret held her daughter with tears of joy streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the miracle of creating new life despite all the obstacles they had overcome. James sat beside the bed, gently touching his daughter's tiny fingers while marveling at Margaret's strength throughout the ordeal. The woman who had been abandoned as unwanted had just given him the most precious gift imaginable. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "She's ours," Margaret replied, and in those words lay everything that mattered. Catherine's arrival transformed the ranch in ways both subtle and profound. The rhythm of their days now revolved around feeding schedules and nap times, but both parents found unexpected joy in these new routines. James proved to be a devoted father, taking over night feedings so Margaret could rest and building a network of baby equipment that allowed Catherine to be safely included in their daily work. Margaret adapted to motherhood with the same practical determination she had applied to every other challenge. She developed efficient systems for managing infant care while maintaining her bookbinding business and contribution to ranch management. Catherine's cradle was often placed beside Margaret's desk while she worked, and the baby seemed to find the sound of her mother's voice soothing whether she was dictating correspondence or singing lullabies. By Catherine's first birthday, the Coleman Ranch had achieved a level of success that exceeded even their most optimistic projections. Their horses were sought after throughout the territory. Margaret's bookbinding business had expanded to serve clients in Denver and San Francisco, and their reputation for reliability had earned them numerous long-term contracts. More importantly, they had created a family that proved assumptions about disability and limitation wrong at every turn. Margaret managed household finances, corresponded with business associates, and raised their daughter with the same competence she had brought to every aspect of their shared life. Visitors to the ranch often expressed surprise at the efficiency with which Margaret navigated motherhood and business responsibilities, but James had long since stopped being amazed by his wife's capabilities. He had learned that what others saw as obstacles, Margaret saw as problems requiring creative solutions. "People expect me to be defined by what I cannot do," Margaret explained to Mrs. Patterson one day while they watched Catherine take her first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor. "But I've always been more interested in discovering what I can do." Their daughter's mobility milestones brought Margaret unexpected joy rather than sadness. She felt no envy watching Catherine run and climb, but rather deep satisfaction in providing her daughter with opportunities for freedom and exploration that had been curtailed in her own life. James built Catherine an elaborate playground behind the house, complete with swings and climbing structures that allowed the toddler to develop confidence and physical skills. Margaret supervised these play sessions from her wheelchair, offering encouragement and ensuring safety while allowing Catherine the independence essential for healthy development. As Catherine grew older, she showed no awareness that her mother's use of a wheelchair was unusual. To her, the rhythm of family life that included ramps instead of stairs and reaching down for hugs instead of up was simply normal. She learned to push Margaret's wheelchair as soon as she was tall enough to reach the handles, treating it as a shared activity rather than assistance. The bond between mother and daughter was evident to everyone who visited the ranch. Catherine would climb onto Margaret's lap to hear stories, help sort papers for the bookbinding business, and chatter constantly about everything she observed during their daily routines. That child has never known a world where her mother's disability limited what their family could accomplish, Dr. Harrison observed during one of his periodic visits. She'll grow up believing women can do anything they set their minds to, which is a remarkable gift. Margaret and James had indeed built something remarkable from the abandoned promise that had brought them together. Their ranch thrived, their daughter flourished, and their partnership had deepened into the kind of love that sustains people through both ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. On quiet evenings, when Catherine was asleep and ranch work was finished, Margaret and James would still sit together on the porch they had shared during those first tentative days of their acquaintance. The conversation was easier now, filled with shared memories and plans for the future, but the fundamental respect and affection that had drawn them together remained unchanged. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Thomas Whitmore had actually met that train?" James asked one evening as they watched sunset paint the familiar hills in shades of gold. Margaret considered the question seriously before answering. "I think I would have been miserable," she said finally. Not because he was a bad man necessarily, but because that arrangement was based on desperation rather than choice. And what we have? What we have is based on deciding, every day, that we want to be here together. That makes all the difference. James reached for her hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "I'm grateful he didn't show up." "So am I," Margaret replied, meaning it completely. The abandoned bride who had once sat alone at Redemption Creek Station had found something far more valuable than the security she had originally sought. She had found a partner who saw her strength rather than her limitations, a purpose that utilized her talents, and a love that had grown from mutual respect into something neither had imagined possible. Their daughter would grow up in a world where the impossible had already been accomplished, where love was measured by daily choices rather than grand gestures, and where the quiet cowboy and the abandoned bride had built a legacy that would endure long after their own story had ended.